Thank y'all for coming out. To get started, I kind of want to get an idea of the demographics that we've got in the room here. So we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to ask y'all some questions. How many parents do we have in here? Okay, majority of parents. A lot of people in the back. How many grandparents do we have here? Okay. How many people that work with children on a regular basis do we have in here? Okay. Very good. Now, for those of y'all that don't have children and y'all are here, I'm still glad that y'all are here today. I'm glad that y'all are here because some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today is stuff that more than likely over the next decade may become more and more important to y'all. And some of the information I will be sharing is information that I wish I would have known when I was your age. So I think everything that we're going to share today is going to be applicable and it's going to be able to help people out. And I'm really excited that everyone came out today. I see a few unfamiliar faces in the room, so I'm going to give a brief introduction. A lot of y'all do know me. I'm Stephen, or Steve Black. Stephen to the government and to my parents. Steve to most everyone else that knows me. I'm a graduate of Harding University. Currently I'm pursuing an MBA at Liberty University. I work in IT. I work at a company called Inspirus, which was recently purchased by Sodexo. Why do I tell y'all that I work in IT? I tell y'all that I work in IT because I don't stand up in front of people and talk a whole lot. And since I don't stand up in front of people and talk a whole lot, and very often whenever I'm working, I will give very small, terse commands to a computer, and the computer will do a whole bunch of stuff as soon as I hit the enter key. And sometimes my verbal communication style, I'll say something where I think that everyone gets it, and they don't. We've got a lot of material that we're going to run through today, but if I do have one of those moments and I see a whole bunch of heads, what did he say? Or a whole bunch of, don't hesitate to pause me. I'll try to rephrase it, run over it again, and if I still don't get it, I'm going to try to get through all this in time where we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and I can clarify. I'm married to my high school sweetheart. We have 2 great kids and 2 absolutely rotten Labradors. And I'm an author. I'm an author of the book called What Kind of Watchman Are You? The cover's on the binders, which y'all have. I'm also the father of a survivor. I'm the father of a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. When I became the father of a survivor, statistically, my wife and I were instantly put at a higher probability for divorce. And my child was put at a higher risk of suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, and other life challenges. This was somewhat a challenge to me because I've grown up in the church. I'd been raised in a Christian family, and I attended a Christian university. But I had never heard a lesson on the adult side of childhood sexual abuse. Sure, when I was little, I heard about stranger danger and inappropriate touch, but never had I been taught as a father, you might have to deal with this, and here's what you do. One thing that we cannot do with this is we cannot hide behind the faith. The statistics about the incidents of abuse are stable. And what I mean by stable is they are stable across regions of the country. So wherever it is that you live in the United States, it's there. Socioeconomic. Do you live on the north side of Fort Worth or do you live in South Lake? It doesn't matter, it's stable. Your education. Did you drop out of high school or do you have a doctorate? It doesn't matter. Racial. Red, yellow, black, or white. The statistics are stable. and they are also stable across faiths. We have a need for resources that are current for our families. And as a result of that need, we wanted to ensure that families have these resources available to them. I'm the founder of a ministry called the Ezekiel 33 Project. We did this to make resources available. We look to support families who are dealing with the aftermath of childhood sexual abuse. They're not alone and they're not crazy. They're dealing with real demons. We look to educate the families so that they can become good watchmen. As good watchmen, they can look and they can see what is it. They can see some of the precursors, or they can see some of the behaviors, and perhaps stop what it is that's going on. We use the metaphor of Ezekiel 33, verses 2 through 6 as a good watchman. It's something that Corey talked about this morning. I'm going to read this right now so we can be introduced to the concept of the watchman. Son of man, speak to your people and say to them, if I bring the sword upon a land, and the people of the land take a man from among them, and make him their watchman, and if he sees a sword coming upon the land, and blows the trumpet, and warns the people, then if anyone who hears the sound of the trumpet does not take warning, and the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be upon his head. He heard the sound of the trumpet, and did not take warning. His blood shall be upon himself. But if he had taken warning, he would have saved his life. But if the watchman sees the sword coming, and does not blow the trumpet, so that the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes away any one of them, that person is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand. Child sexual abuse is a form of child abuse in which an adult or an older adolescent uses a child for sexual stimulation. Normally this is a taboo subject. It's not anything that we talk about in our families or in our churches. And as a result of not having the conversations, what we have is we have a silent crisis on our hands. Here over the next series of few slides, we're going to talk about some statistics, and we're going to introduce the good watchman. Then later on, we're going to roll into additional topics that are going to be covered later on. So let's take 50 youth from a congregation. So at the Keller Church of Christ, it takes about 5 to 6 years in order to graduate 50 youth. We've all heard sermons on this. Somewhere around 35 of those youth are going to end up leaving the faith after they leave high school. And then later on, later in life, 18 will return. So they will either miss the fellowship, they will either get married, and at the time that they get married, they'll make the decision that they're going to come back to the faith, or they'll get married, have a child, and at the point in time that they have a child, they'll realize, you know what? I want my child to experience what it was that I experienced. So then at that point in time, they'll come back to the faith. 10 of those 50 were molested as a child. 4 of the 18 that never returned to the faith were molested. We don't know why they didn't come back. However, it can certainly be a discouraging factor if something wasn't handled correctly. Here's one of the scary ones. Only 1 in 10 will speak up. So what we have here is we have between a 3 and 12% chance that an incident of molestation will be reported. Of the reports to law enforcement, only 24% of those reports are pursued. Of the reports that are pursued, between 1 and 2% will actually result in a conviction. What this means is that there is a 0.24% chance per incident of molestation that the person who committed this will end up being prosecuted for it. So if we want to look at real numbers, if we take 1,000 incidents of molestation, you would have 2.4 of those incidents that would result in a conviction. And since we don't have a 0.4 of a person running around, it's either going to be 3 or 2. What this means is we have offenders walking among us that do not have the label that so many of us as parents have kind of been trained to depend upon. Centers for Disease Control, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are molested before the age of 18, and according to the American Society for the Positive Care of Children, only 1 in 10, this is that 1 in 10 that I was mentioning, will ever tell anyone. Darkness to light. 90% of the survivors know who it was that molested them. And up to 34% of molestations occur at the hand of a family member. The younger that a survivor is at the time that they were molested, the higher the probability that it was a family member that committed the crime. 40% of the abusers are under the age of 18. 5 years difference in age is very often what it is that will cause law enforcement to draw the line between aggressive play or inappropriate play and molestation, or a significant difference in size. One of the things that disturbed me as I began doing the research that I did for Watchman is all of the incidents where people knew and they remained silent. Jerry Sandusky, football coach, he was reported several times to the university administration. University administration didn't follow through, didn't take it to law enforcement, and the number of survivors that suffered at his hand grew. Boy Scouts of America, earlier in this decade, there was a document done. Thousands of incidents of abuse that had been reported to Boy Scouts of America. The Boy Scouts of America did not report to the authorities, documenting many young men who had suffered at the hands of scoutmasters. So at this point in time right now, you might be saying, okay, Steve, that's great, but we go to church and most of our friends and family are members of the church. Okay. Matthew Jordan, minister at the Center Road Church of Christ in Saginaw, Michigan. Prior to being the minister at Center Road Church of Christ in Saginaw, Michigan, he was a youth minister somewhere in Middle Tennessee. Forget the exact time frame, but sometime before he went to Michigan, he had been accused of inappropriate conduct with a child. As a result of that inappropriate conduct with a child, he was then investigated. As we go back to the stats, an investigation doesn't mean a conviction, and he was dismissed. He then moved to Michigan. Within 2 years of being in Michigan, he was then arrested for inappropriate conduct with a minor. Dr. Bert Thompson of the Apologetics Press. Apologetics Press, great publication. Many of our churches have those publications within their 4 walls. But Dr. Bert Thompson had a problem. Dr. Bert Thompson had a problem with young men. And there was an accusation that was brought to the elders under which he served. And those elders essentially said, look, we have to have more before we're going to do anything about this. 18 months later, there was a report that didn't go to the elders under which he served, but that went to a police department, and as a result of the report going to the police department, Dr. Bert Thompson was arrested and was convicted. In all of these cases, somebody knew that the individual who was arrested had a problem, but remained silent. All too often, people just remain silent, and the abuse continued. Who was keeping watch? Who was minding the store? A watchman. A watchman is a person who is to keep watch or guard something. We already went over the verse, Ezekiel 33, 2 through 6, regarding the watchman. A good watchman is going to have 4 traits. A good watchman is going to be responsible. A good watchman is going to pay attention to the details. A good watchman is going to be willing to inconvenience himself, and a good watchman is going to be willing to inconvenience others. And most importantly of all, he's going to be willing to overcome passivity. So really what we're looking for is an individual kind of like this. Maybe not necessarily armed to the teeth, but someone that's watching out. He's up in his tower, he's up in his post, he's looking at what's going on. And a little bit less like this. And this. Definitely not that. But a little bit more like this. Why do the stats matter? This is a quote that's in your book and on the introductory sheet. This is something that came out in 2015. But a primary reason why abuse victims are afraid of the church is because of the level of immaturity and ignorance they have experienced at how they are treated or handled by the community and leadership of a church. How are we supposed to be? Are we a survivor-friendly organization? What happens when this happens in a family? Sides are often chosen. What side is mom and dad going to take? What about the rest of the family? What's the rest of the family going to do? Often the survivor is the one that is feeling like the odd person out. I've got a very unscientific poll, extremely unscientific, but of 29 young women who meet at a support group at one of our Christian colleges, roughly half have told their parents what it was that happened to them. So they went off to school, they found out about this support group, and they opened up in the support group. Half of them have told their parents what happened to them. Only 2 of the 29 are supported by their parents. And the rest are left with, we're not going to talk about this because of who it is that you're saying did this to you. We don't believe it. Others that are told, we just don't want to talk about it. They're left to deal with it in silence. And then there are others that are told that they need to work on their forgiveness in their heart. I had the privilege of being invited to the Harding University Bible Lectureship back in September of 17. And at the lectureship, they had a new track this past year. What they had is a track called Predators in the Pews. And the Predators in the Pews track was essentially where we were talking about what it is that we're talking about here today, because of the challenges that are going on in society today. I had the opportunity to sit on a panel discussion. Panel discussion in a room not too different than this room right here, essentially where it was being moderated by a minister at a congregation there in town, and we were being asked different questions. And it was very evident after about the third question that they were asking the wrong questions. Because the panelists, pretty well in unison, shifted the focus from predators in the pews to, are we so good at dealing with survivors that we're ready for predators in the pews? During that discussion, the times that I would be up and I would be speaking, I noticed an individual, we're going to call him Joe. Joe was sitting about right where Chris is, right there. Joe was very, very focused. The entire discussion, it didn't matter who it was that was up, Joe was very intently listening. He sat through both sessions, so it was 2 one-hour sessions. They had the first session, and as the session dismissed, nobody got up and left. Just more people came in, and he stayed right there, and he sat and he listened intently. He was an older gentleman. After we were done, he kind of grabbed me and he asked me, he said, "Where have you been?" Where have I been? I've been in Fort Worth. I've been working. I've been doing what it is that I do. I said, "No, where is the message that you're talking about? Where has it been?" And I told him, "Well, I saw a need, so I started talking about it." He said, and that was when he told me his story. So I'm going to share Joe's story with you. You see most of it up here on the screen already. But Joe revealed to me that his daughter was molested by an individual that was in the church. And fearing scandal, the elders rushed to Joe, rushed to his daughter, surrounded them, and basically said, "Look, you have to forgive this, and we don't want the authorities involved." Consequently, that's illegal in the state of Texas. I don't know what state he's from, but that's illegal in the state of Texas. Joe knew that he should have stood up to the situation, but he didn't. As a result, the daughter, which he had so many wonderful dreams for, he had hoped that he would have grandchildren, he had hoped that she would find a fine Christian man and get married to that fine Christian man. Instead, 20 years later, he has a daughter that's incapable of holding a relationship, holding a job, who's an alcoholic, and who will have absolutely nothing to do with the church. Consequently, Joe still is involved with church, but he's not involved with that church. There's more like Joe that had similar stories. Folks, we got a problem. We've got a big problem. The tools that are in play with this problem are called deception, empathy, and apathy. Those are the tools that are used to gain access. They're I guess you would say they're the macro tools. So we've got macro tools and we've got micro tools. The micro tools, I guess you could call, those are the techniques. Those are what's used to defend or to continue the abuse. And what we have with the problem is we have a problem that requires a good watchman. To be good watchmen, what are we looking for? I understand that what it is that we're talking about here is really dark. It's not necessarily the most pleasant of topics to discuss. But we have to understand the tools and the techniques that we're looking for, or we can't stop it. By not learning about those who would do our loved ones harm, we're choosing to be blind to the situation. Child molesters have to have deception, empathy, and apathy. I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to give my plug on this. These techniques and these tools are not just used by child molesters. They're used by emotional abusers. They're used by those who commit intimate partner violence. They're used just by regular old child abusers, and they're used by bullies. Okay, they're used by the whole gamut. But for the focus of what it is that Ezekiel 33 focuses on, and the main drive of this presentation, we're going to be talking about childhood sexual abuse. Grooming. Grooming is what's used to gain access. Grooming is the building of a friendship or establishing an emotional connection with a child, and very often the parents. This is done so the child and the parents will lower their inhibitions to the interactions that they have with the individual. The objective of grooming is to break down barriers enough to where sexual abuse can be committed and the child really doesn't cry foul. All abuse involves crossing a boundary. Most of the abusers, they build up their trust, cross the lines, back to the grooming. All of the tools and the techniques that we're talking about, they're used to violate boundaries. So we have deception, empathy, and apathy. As we look at deception, empathy, and apathy, what we're looking at, any one of these can be used to abuse a child. However, in combination or in a triad, it could be particularly bad. The Bible illustrates all of these tools in 2 Samuel 13. Deception, 2 Samuel 13. I'm gonna lay out 2 Samuel 13 here. I'm not gonna read it for the interest of time because I do want us to have time for the Q&A at the end of this. So if it's okay with y'all, we're gonna use the Steve's revised version. However, if you have your Bible, please turn there and read it. And if you don't have your Bible with you, the verses are printed in the material that you have. When you get home, check me on this, okay? Absolutely check me on this. But I'm going to give the Steve's revised version of 2 Samuel 13, and then we're going to talk about each one of these tools as it's laid out in 2 Samuel 13. So we've got Amnon, who is the oldest son of David. And then we have Absalom, who is another one of David's sons by another wife. And then we have Tamar, who is Absalom's sister and also David's daughter by the wife that also bore Absalom. Amnon was absolutely infatuated with Tamar. Okay? So much so that one of Amnon's friends, Jonadab, noticed. He knew that Amnon was smitten with Tamar. Jonadab and Amnon came up with a plan to get Amnon close to Tamar. So this wasn't an all of a sudden. This didn't accidentally happen. This was something that was planned out, that was going to happen. One question that I would ask, as I off-road even maybe a little bit more here, but if Jonadab noticed that Amnon was so focused on Tamar, did anyone else notice this? I would contend that it is possible that was the case, although the scripture doesn't tell us. So Amnon and Jonadab came up with a plan where Amnon was going to pretend to be sick, and as Amnon pretended to be sick, David would notice, and then there would be an opportunity for Amnon to request David to send Tamar to Amnon to cook in front of him. So now we're talking about deception. So this was the deception that Amnon and Jonadab cooked up. To deceive, lies and untruths must be told. Lies about the activity, about the location, about the intent. Encouraged to cover up the abuse, or information that's withheld. Information that's withheld about the history, about the activity, the location, or the intent. Deception has been used by man from the beginning. Cain and Abel, Genesis 4, 8 through 10. Cain had killed Abel. Cain's walking along. God asked Cain, "Cain, where's your brother?" What does Cain do? He plays dumb. He's trying to fool God. Didn't work. David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. 2 chapters earlier in 2 Samuel, in 2 Samuel 11. David did everything that he could to cover up his adultery with Bathsheba, to the point that he essentially became a murderer by having Uriah sent to the front lines and then having the troops pull back to ensure that Uriah was killed, to cover up the fact that he had committed adultery with Uriah's wife. Ananias and Sapphira, Acts chapter 5. Ananias and Sapphira sold a piece of property, told the church that the whole sum of money from the sale of the property is what they gave, when in fact they had held some back for themselves. Deception. Empathy. Going back to 2 Samuel 13, empathy in verses 6 through 10. Amnon pretended to be ill. As he pretended to be ill, it got David's attention. David then used his father's empathy for Amnon to go and get Tamar, and then to send Tamar to Amnon in order for Tamar to cook in front of Amnon. After cooking in front of Amnon, then Amnon took her and then raped her. Amnon's illness worked on Amnon's dad. Amnon's illness worked on Tamar until he turned on her. This was an offensive use of empathy. There's also a defensive use of empathy that we're going to cover a little bit later. The offensive use of empathy is used in order to gain access. It's used to gain access to our children. The defensive use of empathy is used to dismiss suspicion or to avoid being turned in. Amnon faked his illness to gain this access, and he faked his illness to lure Tamar. Let's think for a second about the person who will play sad when a child won't hug them. The person that will play sad when a child won't hug them. Do we encourage the child? No, go on, give them a hug. You see, you're making them sad. Should we do that? I would say no. We shouldn't do that. There's a reason why that child doesn't want to give that individual a hug, and we shouldn't tell that child that their feelings about that particular situation at the moment don't matter. As we wear down their conscience, if they end up in a situation later on that's harmful, they're less likely to have a voice for themselves, because we've taken their voice away, because we've made our child go hug people that they don't want to hug from however old they were whenever they started walking. Apathy. Verses 20 and 21. In the aftermath of all this, David did absolutely nothing. And even before, David didn't do anything. Did David not notice that Amnon had the feelings the way that he did? I mean, Jonathan noticed. It's possible that because of his own sin troubles, that David lost his boldness. Often sin will do that to one. By doing nothing, how valued did Tamar feel? So as we're talking about apathy, really what we're talking about here is passivity. David did nothing. Absalom did nothing. And then after 2 years, because David didn't, then Absalom finally said, enough of this. Absalom then did something. He had Amnon killed. An apathetic individual will often not challenge a deception either in progress or after the fact. Apathy is how the average molester has between 50 and 150 survivors before their incarceration. Watching the news this week, did anyone pay attention to the news? How many of those gymnasts? The last number was, as I remember, it was over 160. And those are just the ones that showed up in court to speak against him. The earliest accusation against Larry Nassar was 30 years ago. So he was allowed to operate for 30 years. Multiple accusations. Multiple people failing to watch. Multiple people failing to pick up on the subtle cues of deception, of empathy. And there were plenty that were apathetic. There are far more survivors out there than that there are predators. Second Samuel 13 also gives us a secondary abuse preview. Secondary abuse is what we're going to be talking about in the next segment. Here coming up. But in 2 Samuel 13, 21 and 22, quoting Absalom here. Hold your peace, my sister. He's your brother. Do not take this to heart. In two sentences, we see three forms of secondary abuse. Keep quiet about this. Silence. We don't talk about it. He's your brother. Entitlement. Don't take this to heart. Minimization. Tamar. What was the relationship with her father? At the beginning of 2 Samuel 13, we see David going back to his house to send Tamar to Amnon. But by the time that we get to the tail end of 2 Samuel chapter 13, we learned that Tamar lived a desolate life in Amnon's house. David's the king. Why does the daughter of the king move out of dad's house and move into her brother's house? There was a problem. How does the daughter of a king end up this way? She had a good family name. She was connected politically. But due to one incident that was deeply personal and handled extremely poorly, she led a desolate life in her brother's house. Molesters know that people let their guard down in familiar settings. Let's think about this for a second. Stranger danger, right? Everyone's heard of it? Stranger danger? Just yes? Okay. All right. So when we're out in public, if this were a boxing match, okay? When we're out in public, we're walking around like this. We're thinking we're going to get hit, okay? We're absolutely convinced that we're going to get hit. We're walking around in public like this, and when I'm like this, my peripheral vision is blocked. I can't see around me, okay? I can't see the souls that need Jesus Christ around me because I'm walking around with my hands up like this because I'm afraid of what's going to happen to my children. Yet, when I get in a familiar setting, knock me out, please, because my hands are down. That's what we do. When we have a high percentage situation of something happening to our kids, we have our hands down. And when we have a low percentage situation of something happening to our kids, we've got it backwards, folks. We've got it backwards. 90% of the time, the molester is known to us, and only 10% of the time is it a stranger. So what we've covered to this point, we've covered the big tools, we've covered the macro tools, if you will. We've covered deception, we've covered empathy, and we've covered apathy. And we've also touched briefly on the fact that with empathy, we have both offensive and defensive apathy that's used to either gain access or to minimize suspicion. All right, we've been going now for, well, I got my clock started a little bit late. I realized that I had not been going for 5 seconds when I was on about slide 12. So we've been going for a little bit. Let's take about a 5 to 7 minute break if you need to. And then we're going to get started with the techniques and then the action. And then go to Q&A. Thank you. We're getting close. So while the remainder of the people are getting back, I kind of want to go over this real quick. All right, so every family and or individual, if you're single, it's one of these books. Feel free to keep this. It's got the meat of the presentations in it. And then in the back, it has a couple of different things. One, it's got I guess you would say a glossary or index of terms, so to speak, different techniques that are used that we're going to be talking about here in a little bit. We're not going to talk about every one of them. We're going to talk about the ones that are the most common. What I mean by the most common is Ezekiel 33 has been in existence now for approaching 4 years, and from different individuals and different congregations all throughout the country who have contacted me. What we're going to be talking about in the presentation today are the most common techniques that are used whenever congregations or families are dealing with abuse. The things that were used on them in order to keep from turning someone in, and then therefore abuse ends up continuing. Also, is going to, in the back section, I've got a supplemental material section. One of these is on a new diagnosis for childhood trauma by the American Psychological Association. This is information that I came across when I was at Pepperdine, and I was able to collaborate with another group that does similar work. And I found this article to be somewhat interesting. And then after that, I have a brief one-paragraph write-up called The Impact, and then after that, I have essentially the entire victim impact statement that Allie Raisman gave in the Nassar trial that wrapped up this week. As you read this statement, you will find some very interesting things about what has happened in this young woman's life and how she interacts with people and her family as a result of what it was that happened to her. In the very back, there's a recommended reading section. There's also, I believe, contact information for places to reach out to get help or to get counseling should you ever need it. During the break, I also handed this out. So this is a Fox News story. Actually, Fox News is where I printed it from, but it was all over. This is of a case that happened in Colorado. And what was very interesting about this particular case that happened in Colorado is as I read the news story, I was able to pick out the various techniques that were used by not only the perpetrator, but also the individuals who enabled him to continue abusing. So as you'll see, different highlights, different colors, and then red text out to the side. That's me calling out the different types of techniques that were implemented that this young woman had to endure. So that's just kind of a preview as far as what it is that you have in the materials that were handed out for you here. So let's talk about the techniques. Actually, before we talk about the techniques, let's talk about some prevention. If Carter Blood Care rolled up their blood donor bus out in the parking lot, and we all got up in single file and we marched out there. As we were all getting screened, each time that each one of us was getting screened, we would be talking to an individual that was wearing gloves. They don't know if I'm carrying something that could get them sick. They don't know if you're carrying something that could get them sick. But everyone gets the same treatment. And everyone gets the same treatment because they don't know. Well, what about with our children giving everyone the same treatment? Universal precautions. With our children, let's think about a target. With a target, you have concentric circles, going down to a bullseye. Each person in your child's life belongs in a ring. So you've got mom and dad kind of in the center of the bullseye. And the next ring out, maybe you have some extended family, some very close family friends. Maybe in the next ring, you have even further extended family that you don't see that often. And then you've got friends and acquaintances, and as it goes out, the closer that you get to the center, there's more time and contact with your child. So now talking about universal precautions. What about when someone that's on an outer ring starts making movement into one of the inner rings? Well, do you question their motivation? And when you question their motivation, is their motivation because they're building a closer relationship with you, or are they building a closer relationship with your child than what they are with you? What about their integrity? Have they ever lied to you for anything more than a surprise birthday party? If they have, maybe you need to question whether or not you, as the parent, allow them into one of the inner rings. We're continuing to study our opponents. This is dark, I know, but we're going to continue to study our opponents because we need to know the types of behavior that we need to look for that's going to raise the red flag that might cause someone to question something that could potentially stop abuse from occurring or continuing. 93% of sex offenders describe themselves as religious, according to the Abel and Harlow child molestation study. That means that 93% of those who would do our children harm, they know our tendencies very, very well. They know the buzzwords to say in the event that they get caught. They know what to do to avoid consequences in a church setting. What we're going to be talking about, some samples of techniques that are used by the abuser or by their advocates, otherwise known as flying monkeys. To achieve, this is done to achieve the abuser's desired result. To move into one of those inner rings, to avoid being turned in, therefore avoiding consequences, or to continue abusing. Disclaimer again, all of these can be used for emotional abuse, for bullying, for intimate partner violence. Silence. Our lives begin to end the moment that we become silent about the things that matter. Dr. Martin Luther King. Silence is a technique that is used to isolate the survivor, their family, those around them. This is a method of limiting where it is that they get their information. And this is something that's actively used by predators and their flying monkeys. Silence is often demanded. It's often demanded by the family, or by the survivor, and to their family. By other family members, by the church. If you're involved with a youth organization, by the leaders of a youth organization. This is done to cover up what happened. Basically, it's kind of one of those nothing to see here, move along kind of techniques. In reality, what this does is this amplifies the guilt that a survivor feels. A survivor has been violated deeply, personally. They did nothing wrong, but they were told to be quiet about it. Well, when we do something right, we don't stay hush-hush about it. I mean, I guess sometimes maybe we do because we're trying to be humble. But if we do something right, it's not forbidden to remain to speak up about it. But in a silent scenario, it is. What this does is this creates an inner conflict with the survivor as they're dealing with what it was that happened to them. Defensive empathy. So this is the other side of the coin that we talked about. We talked about offensive empathy where David felt sorry for his son, so he sent Tamar to Amnon. Now we're talking about the defensive side of empathy. Abusers and molesters are often very well liked. They're often very helpful. Sometimes they may have a situation in their life that causes others to feel sorry for them. Defensive empathy is all about the image. It's all about how everything looks on the outside. This is done that way in the event of an accusation, there will be comments like, they wouldn't do that. Look at all the good that they do. They wouldn't do that. Or they've been through so much. Why in the world would you do this to them when they're down? Why would you turn them in while they're down? They're on the rebound. This is done to prevent facing the consequences. Defensive empathy is something that leverages cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance, this is a way that we resolve conflict in our own mind. Really, if you think about it, it's rationalization. So you know something is one way, and you have a belief about it, and inside we don't like having inner conflict. And since we don't like having inner conflict, we will change our attitude or our belief about something in order to become right with what's going on in our mind. So let me give you an example. I gave you all a little bit of insight as to what it is that I do day to day. I'm in IT. Since I'm in IT, a lot of times I sit down a lot all day long until I got a Veridesk. So now, maybe not so much. But previously, I used to sit down a lot, all day long. So I know that sitting is bad for me. Okay? Well, to justify the fact that sitting is bad for me, what did I do? I'd go run on my lunch break. And I'd go work out at night. And I would tell myself, okay, well, since I'm running over lunch and I'm working out at night, I'm canceling out the bad that I'm doing sitting all day long. I adjusted my belief as to what was bad for me so I don't have that inner conflict going on inside my head. Flying monkeys. Yes, they came out of the Wizard of Oz. Flying monkeys are the individuals that will help an abuser, and they will help an abuser no matter what. They're individuals who will build a real or apparent deep relationship with the abuser will build a real or apparent deep relationship with the flying monkeys. And these flying monkeys are the ones that do the non-physical work of the abuser. Often, flying monkeys are emotionally abused by the abuser. Think of the parent who would refuse to turn a child in because they've been manipulated emotionally by that child. Think of the spouse that would refuse to turn another spouse in because they're financially afraid of what would happen if one of them got turned in for abuse. Flying monkeys side with the abuser. Simply put, they're bad watchmen. They see what's happening, but they refuse to help at best, and at the worst, they actively work to give the abuser access to someone who's been abused. Gaslighting. It's after the 1944 movie Gaslight, starring Ingrid Bergman and Robert Boyer. This is a crazy-making behavior. This is a situation where language and facts are manipulated, basically in an effort to make someone that has an accusation to make about an abusive situation really question what is reality. Another way that one could look at it is in the physical world. Imagine if you had a roommate and y'all shared an apartment, and this roommate is just cruel, all right, mean. You go to bed at night, and after you're good and asleep, they rearrange the furniture in the apartment. And you wake up the next morning, and one morning you trip over the ottoman. Bam, on the floor. Why'd you do that? What are you talking about? The next night, okay, you remember the layout of the apartment. You go to bed, after you're sound asleep, they rearrange the furniture, and the next morning you wake up and it's not the ottoman you trip over, it's the couch. And then they get to be really, really nice. One night they don't move anything at all. They don't move anything at all. So you wake up and you're expecting it now. But nothing happened. You don't stub your toe on anything. So you think, oh, my roommate learned. So then the next night you go to sleep, and something moves, and sure enough the next morning, you trip over yourself. So that's in the physical world. Now, in the emotional world, or in the world of facts and situations around an abusive situation, manipulating the language, talking, saying that something happened one time and then later the facts change just a little bit. That's what's going on when you're dealing with a gaslighter. This is done to create doubt and to minimize the seriousness of the situation. Hey, I didn't say that. What I said was, are you sure that's what I said? I don't recall ever saying that. If you're dealing with a gaslighter, very often you feel like you either have to record on your smartphone or you have to take notes about every conversation that you have with them. That way you can reconcile everything and make sure that you are remembering accurately what it was, because the facts have moved so many times you don't know what the truth is anymore. Weaponized forgiveness. Weaponized forgiveness, predominantly, based on the contact that I've had around the country, predominantly is something that involves families that are involved in the faith. Remember how religious molesters are? 93%? Here's how a weaponized forgiveness scenario will lay out. A predator will be caught. Before the authorities get involved, either they will rush to the family and maybe the child that was abused, and they will beg for forgiveness. They might even be so bold as to bring a ministry leader, a deacon, or an elder with them to this event, begging for forgiveness. What this is this is the quick, cheap grace forgiveness. And then after they do that, they go and they hide behind the cross. All of this happens before the family or the survivor can completely process what it was that happened to them. And whenever the family or the survivor does not act exactly, and I mean exactly as they did towards the person who abused them, that's when the heavy doses of Matthew 18 start. That's when the parable of the lost sheep, coin, and son start. And other verses involving forgiveness start getting poured on. And then that's when the flying monkeys come in. Everyone jumps out from behind the cross and then points and claims how unforgiving the family who is now turning an offender in for a crime that they committed. How unforgiving they are. When talking about cheap grace real quick, I don't know how familiar everyone is with it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer defined it as the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, and grace without Jesus Christ. Weaponized forgiveness applies guilt to those who did no wrong. You need to repent of your unforgiving heart. Remember the girls that I mentioned at the very beginning? Where their families are basically telling them, look, you need to work on your forgiveness. What kind of Christian are you if you can't forgive? Forgiveness is not the elimination of consequences. David lost a child that was conceived with Bathsheba. Zacchaeus, whenever Jesus brought him or came to his house that day, it was only after Zacchaeus repented and said that he was going to repay those that he had defrauded fourfold before Christ said that forgiveness had come to his house that day. Forgiveness is not the equivalent of trust. If I have a loan with ABC Banking Incorporated, and then I file for bankruptcy, after 7 years' time, and I'm able to go out and apply for credit again, if I go to ABC Banking Company and I apply for another loan and they reject me, is it that the bank didn't forgive me, or is it that the bank doesn't trust me? The bank is no longer sending a bill to my house that was forgiven in my bankruptcy proceedings. But they don't trust me, and they don't trust me because previously I had defaulted on a loan which I had taken out with them. It's not a matter of forgiveness, it's a matter of trust. Forgiveness often comes on the survivor's time frame and not on the time frame of the predator. But very often, the predator demands the forgiveness be on their timeline. The goal of weaponized forgiveness is a distraction. Weaponized forgiveness is a game of misplaced sympathies. It takes the sympathies from the individual who was abused and puts it onto the individual who did the abusing. So now, those were the techniques. Those were the most common techniques that individuals who have reached out to me over the last 4 years have described. Now we're going to talk a little bit about our response. I had to have a place to put this, and I couldn't find the best. If we're going to be a survivor-friendly church, we need to know what things not to do with a survivor and the things to do with a survivor. The following are examples of victim shaming. So that means don't do this. Do not ask repeatedly what was done. If someone shared with you what was done to them, don't repeatedly ask. Don't ask if you're sure that that happened. Do not ask what they were wearing. It doesn't matter what they were wearing. They didn't deserve to be violated in the way that they were violated. And do not ask why now. When a survivor chooses to disclose that they have been abused, that is information that they own, and they can choose to disclose when it is that they want to. I understand that in the political environment that we're in, that there's been some recent stuff in the news. And it's unfortunate that there were people that were trying to make political gain with this topic. But I can tell you that statistically, whenever you are not dealing with a situation where there is a custody dispute, when a survivor chooses to disclose the fact that they had been molested, the incidence of inaccurate reporting or fraudulent reporting is then the low single-digit percentages. So how do we respond? Let's start with I believe you. I believe you. Followed by I'm glad you're safe, or let's get you somewhere safe if you don't believe that the individual is in a safe position. I'm glad you told me. You did nothing wrong. These are good ways to respond if someone performs an outcry to you. An outcry is when someone decides to disclose to you what it was that happened to them. If the incident just happened, call the police. If the incident happened sometime back, call the Tarrant County Women's Center. The Tarrant County Women's Center offers counseling, and the Tarrant County Women's Center will also guide the family through the reporting process. All incidents of childhood sexual abuse must be reported by ministers, elders, parents, and teachers. This is according to the Texas Family Code, Chapter 261. Criminal penalties do exist if you do not report incidents of abuse. Silence, one of the techniques that we talked about earlier. Silence amplifies a family's risk to prosecution under this law. Are we going to follow Romans 13:1 or are we not? So there's many techniques that are used to stop or prevent accusations. These were just a sample of what's used. Many of these are used to misplace the sympathies from the survivor to the abuser. Now for the action. What's our part? So now that we know some of the techniques that we need to watch out for, some of the things that we need to look at, what do we need to do is we're making the decision that we're going to be a good watchman and we're going to watch over not only our own kids, but those that are around us. First of all, we have to overcome passivity. We have to be able to speak up. This is a challenge that man has had from the beginning. As Adam was sitting there with Eve in the garden, thank you for mentioning it this morning, Corey. Adam was there. He saw this going on. He didn't speak up. He didn't say a word. Think of all the evil that has happened in the world throughout history. Not because nobody knew that it was going on, but because nobody took a stand. Passivity is what will prevent our action. If we take a look at the Samaritan overcame his passivity and he did the most good. A good watchman will overcome passivity and he will do the right thing. If we look at Luke 10, verses 29 through 37, we all know the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So we have a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho. Man going from Jerusalem to Jericho falls among robbers, gets beaten, and he's left in the ditch. Then we have a priest cruise by, passes by on the other side. We have a Levite cruise by, passes by on the other side. Were they distracted? Were they busy? My argument would be, in the event that this particular situation happens with us, an outcry of abuse is not going to come well-timed. Running across someone who's been beaten and left in the ditch is not going to come well-timed. But there's someone that needs help. Were the priest and the Levite, were they victim shamed? And do we do the same? Well, should he have been there on the road? Was he dressed too nicely walking through the wrong neighborhood, therefore the robbers would think that he had something to take? Why didn't he cry out whenever he was in the ditch as the Levite and the priest were passing by? These types of questions contribute to secondary abuse. So my question would be, who did the most good? Those that were religious and walked by? Or the one that took the time, effort, and resources? And I think we all know the answer to that. The one who took the time, effort, and resources in order to help the man who was left in the ditch is the one that did the most good. If as a church, earlier I mentioned our peripheral vision because we're so worried when we're out in public. If we're unable to recognize and help with the physical needs that individuals have, how can we possibly have the vision for the spiritual needs for a dying world that's around us that needs to hear about Jesus Christ? Without action, how can we help a survivor? Without action, how can we bring the gospel to a world that needs the gospel? Passivity is a much bigger issue. It prevents us from doing a number of things that we should be about. What I can say is, based on the numerous reports that I've dealt with all through the country, the church, our families, our youth organizations have been passive with abuse. The details of what has gone on are different, but what I can say is that silence is almost always employed, amplifying the feelings of guilt. Weaponized forgiveness, misplacing the sympathies from the one who is abused to the abuser. Flying monkeys, misguided alliances are almost always in play. Gaslighting, manipulation, defensive empathy, further manipulation are almost always involved. If we fear for our congregation, our family, our youth organization's reputation if abuse is reported, just wait and see what will happen whenever covered up abuse is then exposed. Look at USA Gymnastics. As a congregation and as families, this needs to become a much more familiar topic, and our stance needs to be known up front. We need to be armed with the appropriate resources, and we also need to know our limitations. The church is a place for Bible study and for spiritual guidance. Our families and our congregations are not law enforcement. We don't know how to investigate these crimes. That's not our job. We need to turn an accusation over to law enforcement and let them do their job. We are also not a mental health practice. Spiritual guidance, absolutely. But there are mental health components to this topic that we are not qualified to take care of. Given the statistics that we've presented today, what would it look like if our families were more survivor-friendly? What would it look like if we were a more survivor-friendly church? A church that has good watchmen will be more welcoming to survivors and will have healthier families as a result. I like this quote from Sir Edmund Burke. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It goes right along with Ezekiel 33 and the Watchman. Love is what motivates the good watchman. Love is what causes the good watchman to have this burning desire to be responsible for what it is that's going on around him. Love is what causes the good watchman to pay attention. If the good watchman sees something that isn't quite right, he notices. And beyond that, the good watchman then inconveniences himself and injects himself into the situation just to be sure that everything stays okay. Just because he's not sure what's going on, he will inject himself into that situation to make sure that things end up being okay. Oh, and by the way, if the individual doesn't necessarily have the best of intentions, when the good watchman inconveniences himself, he also is willing to inconvenience another. And it's love that motivates him to do all of that. And my question to all of us today is, what kind of watchman are you? What kind of watchman are you willing to be?